All right, something a bit different today. More to do with some of the sounds that I've made. I've had some really good feedback about some of the sounds that I made for Tonex and Line 6. Thank you again for all the people that donated and downloaded the sounds. And today I wanted to make a little bit of a video because, as I always say, those are templates, and they need to be tweaked to your setup. Okay, and the video I'm going to make today, I have the big headphones on for because I need to hear the frequencies a bit better. It's a generic video on EQ and what to listen for and what I usually listen for when I play. I'm not a sound engineer as much as I've experience in mixing and stuff like that and producing. I'm not going to be super technical about it, but I want to just share my experience in what I think are areas that are important for guitar, electric guitar, and what I usually listen for when I tweak to create sound, to make an amp sound better in a space, to make a sound that fits better with a particular band or setup or mix. And in general, this has to do a lot this has a lot to do with hearing and recognizing what's the issue or the problem areas and correcting depending on what you're trying to achieve. Okay. As I always say, presets are not absolute. There are presets by style. There are presets in amps by style. Like, I would say a jazz player, as much as I've seen jazz player using triple rectifiers, I would say in general we'll go for like a clean amp, like a Roland or a Fender or something like that. So everything is very much based on style, what your setup is, and what your idea of tone is, what you're hearing in your head. Just like music, you're trying to create something that you hear in your head. You have a vision, in musically speaking. The same thing, sound is the same. You're trying to go for a sound that you maybe have heard from a guitar hero of yours or a band that you appreciate. But again, I assume that the more you know, the better it is. Okay, so I'm going to just share my experience to do with this. So this is one that I'm using today. I'm using Reaper, and I'm using one of my presets is one called Deluxe Simple. Again, the links for the preset, for the Tonex preset, are going to be in the description. And I'm just going to I've made a loop for myself. I'm going to play now. I made it on the Strat, so it's quite clear. It sounds like that. It's kind of like a kind of pop rhythm type thing. Okay. And why EQ? So it will see me look down. I made some notes so I can I have organized things in my head. The first thing you want to EQ for is to correct spikes. Okay, spikes meaning frequencies that tend to poke out and they are annoying. Usually for guitar, there's an area around 3K that is quite harsh in general. That area for all instruments, but for guitar is where the picking happens, and you can hear it quite clearly here. And when I talk about area, it usually is, plus or minus, 500 hertz, more or less. So it's not, when I say 3K, it's not 3000 hertz exactly. You will have to sweep that area and trying to find where the exact problem is. Something you cannot do with something like this, like one of those graphic EQ, which are very handy, and I have it in my boards. This is an MXR, and you can see it. This one actually has 100, 200, 400, 800 hertz, 1.6 kilohertz, and 3.2 kilohertz. And those are important frequencies for guitar. 100 of you would call it the bass, boomy, the bottom end. 200, usually 250 is a cardboardy sound. So you want to usually remove a bit of that, but you might need it. Okay. 400, 500, usually there's the honk, the body usually in rock, you want that to add that. 800 is more like punch. And sometimes I feel in my guitars, especially the Gibson, there's too much of it, so I tend to remove it. It feels like if you feel there's too much weight to the sound, I tend to remove a bit of that. 1.6K is like the nasal sound on the guitar. Is if you want to stick out, if you want to have a bit more your guitar to come out in the mix, usually people tend to add some of that. And 3.K, as I said, is the area I'm talking about right now. To me, it's a bit of a harsh area, so I genuinely try to remove it. As much as some sound engineers, to me, I'm a bit against that, because if you're wearing in-ears, it can be a bit harsh, and it can, put you off a little bit. That 3K area, a lot of sound engineers tend to push it because it gives you the impression of hearing the attack of the guitar. I personally am a little bit against that, and I tend to, in the monitoring app, you can go into the EQ. I usually tend to remove a bit of that to give a bit of longevity to my hearing, so to speak, especially during long gigs. So correct spike is the first one. Sorry if I'm kind of going a bit with the flow, but I think this is going to be one of those videos. The second one is a buildup, is too much of. Usually, guitarists, especially when you have an amp in the room, like you're using an amp, they tend to put too much bottom end because they want that weight. And usually that weight is down here at about 100. Let me go back to my loop. So you can hear there's definitely too much of that woofiness, okay? So usually that's about 100. And that, again, is something that you have to listen for. Is there too much punch? That would be about 800. Is there too much honk? That'd be 500. Describe the sound to yourself with these buzzwords. And I think that really helps if you can connect that the sensation that it gives you with a buzzword and a frequency. And I will make a bit of a summary of that in a minute. The next one is balance an amp to a room. So if you put an amp into a space, let's say, depending on the surfaces, if it's a tall room or if it's a flat room, if you put in the amp on wood, if the space under the stage is empty, the amp will resonate with that room, and there might be a buildup or a lack of certain frequencies. And you have to start to recognize, like the way I describe it to musicians, usually they don't do much engineering or they cannot recognize this, is that usually musicians can recognize major and minor in chords. When they recognize jazz musicians recognize a sharp 9 in a chord, or if that note is the major third or not, that's recognizing the function. This is recognizing sound as frequencies, okay? So it's the same thing, but you're training your ear to recognize something else rather than, let's say, a function or a note, okay? So this is something very similar to that. And there are apps that you can use. I think Sound Gym is a popular one. There are plenty. Just look up frequency recognition app, and you can train your ear by repetition to recognize frequencies. And but I think in general, try to do something like I'm doing right now. Make a loop and then kind of go through frequencies and see what you can connect it with. In this area, it usually sounds XYZ, okay? So, or this is this area of the guitar, okay? Something like that. Okay, as I said, this is a practical video. I don't want it to be too scientific about it. I want to talk about acoustics. I don't want to talk about the technicality, getting too technical about decibels and stuff like that. So I hope that those that are that way inclined are going to be too upset at this. But again, I wanted this to be a bit of an introduction. And again, I wanted to share my experience, as I said. So another reason why we EQ is to make our guitar fit in a mix, okay? Especially if you're in a band that is quite extended. You have horns, you have keyboards, you have some, the EQ that I have in a trio is different from the EQ that I have in a band that has horns, keyboards, drums with cymbals. And, obviously I want to make my guitar maybe a bit smaller and understand that the guitar will be, and if I want to stick out, maybe I'm going to have that 1K area. The area usually between 1K and 2K to me is quite important if you want to, it will sound very nasal, as I said at the beginning, of that 1K area, but it's important for me to stick out. And obviously you have to listen where there's this space in a way. You want to stay away from the very high frequencies where there are cymbals, keyboards, and you want to stay away from the low frequencies where there's the bass and the kick drum and stuff like that. And it will, and obviously you have to, if there's a vocalist, again, you have to be aware of that. Maybe that's more of a spatial thing. Try to get your amp facing away from them. If some mix with a sound engineer, your amp will be just a monitor for yourself. The sound engineer will figure out what to do. But in general, it is just an awareness of what's around you, okay? And in that scenario, which is something I always do in most of my presets, Tonex doesn't have this ability, but let's say line 6, you can put at a high pass and low pass filter. And usually for guitar, because a cabinet doesn't really have much under, let's say, 80 hertz, so I will want a high pass filter. High pass means it will pass the frequencies over a certain frequency. At about 80. And on actually the line 6 pedal, when you go into the cabinet, you can set the high pass and low pass. And I find that very helpful. And in my presets, usually I put a high pass and low pass at about 8K, 80 hertz, and 8K. That's usually what a cabinet carries out, so to speak. Reproduces. And unless maybe you play metal, when you play metal you want that sub, you want that. Let me get rid of this low pass, high pass, sorry. Let me turn it off. Let me just play that loop again. So you can hear that when I'm going down to like 50 or so, there's still a little bit of sound there, and it gives you that kind of sub punch, usually like 50 to 80. I would say that's for metal. Okay, that's for metal. If you play that kind of, sometimes acoustic guitars. For acoustic guitars, there's a slightly different idea because obviously you want more of that kind of sparkly top end. This is more for electric. Okay. So. Yeah, again, this is something you will have to train your ear for. So I want to summarize now and put these frequencies into areas, okay? And it's not necessarily that you have to always cut or always boost. You have to listen and add what you need, okay? And again, the frequency is not going to be exact. These are areas, okay? So as I said, I've just talked about the high pass, low pass. 80 hertz to 8K, generic, very areas, okay, very generic. So I'm going to play that loop now. And the areas, as I said at the beginning, were 100 hertz for bass and boominess. This is how it sounds. Let's find it. 100. You can see there in that little box, the frequency. I'm going to play the loop. Okay, so that's how that sounds. 500 hertz around that area, that kind of honk. You can see it on the scope. But actually, let's kind of go. Sometimes at the 200-300, you want to remove a bit. Let's see how that sounds. I'm exaggerating, obviously, in terms of decibels, how much I'm removing. But you can hear when I boosted it, to me, that sounds quite cardboardy. Okay. So if your amp sounds a bit cardboardy, you want to remove some of that. And obviously, these are combination. I mean, I could add the 100 and remove 200. That will give me some punch at the bottom end and remove that kind of cardboardy element to it. So these are just, I'm talking about individually, but you can make a mix of these. Okay. So the next one would be 500. Let's go up to 500. Okay, you can hear how honky that is. As that kind of throaty sound to it. I found that sounds quite good when like you do certain like rock tones, so to speak. That's a good frequency for that. Again, you have to listen. The 7-800, to me, this is a problem area. I usually, when I'm playing live and I feel there's too much punch to the sound and I want to soften it a bit, this is where I take it off, take it away from that, from the sound. You can hear right away how softer the sound becomes. 1K or so, to me, that's nasal but presence. Like if I want to, from the guitar to stick out in a mix, that's the first one, the first protocol for me, where I go to. You can hear it's more like that kind of nasal sound, okay? And to me, the closer I get to 2K, to me, 2K is a nice frequency for guitar, my personal opinion. And I tend to go towards that if I want to have a slightly more beautiful sound. And yeah, so that's that. 3K is a very harsh area for me. And I usually is the first protocol for removing if I feel the guitar is too much picking. Okay. As I said, some sound engineers tend to kind of push this by default because that's where they want to hear that. I'm a bit against this, but this is how that sounds. So you can hear how instantly the guitar becomes, I want to say, like a bit dull, okay? But you can then maybe boost a bit around that to offset that, okay? And again, once I go above that, the 4K and above, I can probably go with like a high shelf. And if I boost that as a shelf, then let's call it the presence air, the high treble. Let's hear how that sounds. Okay. Difficult to hear because obviously there isn't much of there in an amp. Okay. So also, I think I'm old and I've been playing with bands for decades, so my hearing is not good enough to hear probably about over 10K. So that's usually the air. And I said above 8K, usually if you're using cabinets, there isn't much up there. You have to boost quite a bit. Purely my experience. Okay. As I said, this is a lot to do with the equipment that you have, with the experience that you have, the style that you play, and so on. So when you use distortion, you tend to clip the wave. Sound is just a wave, and this is obviously a perfect sine wave. It won't be like that for guitar unless you zoom in, to it won't be that for guitar. But when you start to use soft clipping, which is overdrive, like a tube screamer and stuff like that, you can see that the spikes, the picks are softened. And same thing if you use hard clipping, which is more like distortion, like a DS1 or something like that, it's even more clipped. So you won't have the problems of the peaks. So that's why when you use distortion, there is less of an issue of having that sound of the pick, okay, of the peak, of the pick, of that harsh picking sound, okay. And obviously, when you use a fuzz, that's even more, uh, heavier. I think this is from one of those Anderton's website. This picture here is from I found it in one of those Anderton's pages. With distortion, you have less of that problem of the finding the spikes, so to speak. Yeah. So I hope this helps. So yeah. So in general, I would say it's an art of being able to hear something and being able to go to a particular frequency, name that area, go into a particular frequency, and fix the issue. Okay. All right, but well, I hope this video helped anyway. I think it was a bit spur of the moment. I was just going with the flow a little bit and just sharing my experience. Like I always say in these videos, I'm not trying to school anybody or claim that I am a specialist in every area, but I have a good 40 years of experience in this kind of stuff, in playing guitar and gigging and stuff like that. So I just wanted to add my experience, and if yours is different, if you want to correct something I've said, and with possibly a link to, I'm always up for learning and for always a polite discussion, as I always say. And check out the links in the description. And I usually leave a pinned comment with a link to the presets that I'm using. Hope this helped. If it has, please share it on social media or with a friend or on things like Reddit or Facebook. That always help. And as always, like and subscribe. That always helps the channel and to push the videos for the algorithm to find this video, if you found that helpful. Well, that's pretty much it, really. Take care. Bye-bye.